All these social systems, they're organic, they're living creatures. There is a way to train people and organizations to set up these networks and to develop these relationships so you can lean on them when you need to. It's not a mystery. It is doable and teachable. And I think that's something that industry and government should really start looking at how to do and how to grow that within those communities.
Hey, this is Ryan Connell with the Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Office, joined here today with Jesse Levin, Jay Long, and Brad Halsey. We have a whole crew today talking, hopefully get into a good conversation. Want to just do a quick around the room for some self-intros. Jesse, you want to start?
Sure. Jesse Levin, currently serving as the Executive Director for the Defense Entrepreneurship Forum, and also runs something called Tactivate, which is a culture mediation, austere environment, logistics outfit.
Awesome. Jay?
Jay Long, co-founder and chief operating officer of Parlay. Additionally, I've been lucky enough to serve as an innovation officer for the Army, primarily in the special operations community for the last 6 years.
Awesome. And Brad?
Yeah, Brad Halsey. I am the CEO and co-founder of Building Momentum. It's a training and technology organization.
Great. Yeah. Hey guys, appreciate you being here today. I think maybe our second ever, not just, one guest, but having a group on, and by far the largest group we've had. So appreciate you. I got a couple notes. I want to jump in. This is an amazing group of, the three of you make up an amazing group of, brain trust. I want to dive in and tap. And, I have a feeling this is the longest I'm going to talk for the next 30 minutes. So I'll just kind of kick it off with one of the topics. Networking. I know Jesse, you brought up a huge community. You want to just talk about the importance of network. And I think the quote that I've written down is network as a weapon system. Let you guys dive in.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way things are going, our AOs are changing, pretty drastically. They're far more geopolitically restrictive, and the way we operate and function in these environments has to change from what we've really optimized for. And pick your event, whether it's the Afghan evac or Ukraine. We saw a complete departure for how things are really getting done on the ground. And for the first time, I think in mass, we recognize that there's this incredible entrepreneurial contingent or folks from the, or prior service or philanthropists or venture capitalists or what have you, this really interesting, diverse subset of people that come together and form these, ad hoc, task forces and that do incredible things, right? Whether it's moving hundreds of people out of Afghanistan or doing, any number of things in Ukraine. It's these informal networks that are really critical to our national security apparatus. And one thing that DEF, kind of harps on is it's really our goal or our MO to just try to de-silo these various resource communities and to provide opportunities to kind of create serendipity and to make sure that the Jay Longs and the Brads and the Ryans of the world get to kind of spark and connect, and meet one another. So when these events arise, there's trusted relationships and this deep bench of expertise that we can all tap into to kind of activate the network as a weapon system, if you will.
Yeah, very cool. Jay, Brad, you got anything you want to add to that?
Right, I can hop in here real quick. I think one of the things that fascinates me endlessly is how much the right network changes the way you approach the problem itself and the way that you approach solutioning. So like when you think about decisioning or you pick your targeting cycle, we can use your OODA loop for this. The right network doesn't just change the way you understand or orient on the problem, it also changes which problems you see in the first place. And I think one of the things that's endlessly interesting to me is when you build really effective networks, both across the joint services, but also across the SID-MIL divide, that's something Brad and Jesse have done a tremendous job of doing, you end up changing the way you conceptualize the problem and allows you to have unique perspectives on not only the type of solutions, but the time horizons for the solution. I think oftentimes there's a tendency in the military to want to solve for the urgent important, like what is the problem right now today? But if we're not thinking in depth, it's really easy to get caught in cycles of challenge. And the right network not only helps you understand the problem better, but allows you to start building towards a solution in a way that's really effective and iterative. One person individually can be defeated. Networks that are resilient and collaborative and that learn from each other are really hard to defeat.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is I think we forget that you can train people how to do this. This is, yes, I mean, Jesse and Jay are cults of personality unto their own, but there is a way to train people and organizations to set up these networks and to develop these relationships so you can lean on them when you need to. It is not a mystery. It is doable and teachable. And I think that's something that I think industry and government should really start looking at how to do and how to grow that within those communities.
Gosh, I think throughout my career, the amount of I'll use community of practice as a naughty word here, but how many I've been a part of that don't exist anymore. And I'm curious, like, where you think the difference between that type of attempt to network is compared to the things that you're talking about that sound like they're overly successful.
I'll take a stab at that. I think that as a national security community, we have a tendency to kind of over-index on systematizing things and putting procedure into place. And what happens in these environments is radically organic, right? Just to give you a data point, we were in Ukraine, maybe it's like 4 or 5 days after the conflict started. And, there are plenty of 18 series folks, prior service folks who showed up, and people who were just kind of running around. And then these really wild individuals and groups, the YPOs and EOs of the world, where we were seeing, not tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands, but like millions and millions of dollars flowing in to do rapid procurement, last mile logistics, contested environment type of stuff, things that we would typically look to DoD or, maybe state or contractors to do. And these were folks, not just the prior service individuals, but entrepreneurs that just said, hey, I'm really passionate about this. And they just showed up and they really figured it out. And I think we'd be remiss to underestimate the efficacy of, as Brad mentioned, like this stuff can be trained. And we're seeing an increasing number of individuals just say, hey, I don't know what this is, but I've got a skill. I've got a network. I want to get involved. And I would call it our force structuring is really changing. And, last point I'll say is, as an example, Joe DeSena, who is the owner of Spartan Race, got a hold of us and said, hey, I just want to do something. I don't know what it is. I've got this, but, this pot of money, guys, tell us what we should do. And in less than a month, we procured over 100 vehicles, got them repaired throughout Eastern Europe, delivered with volunteers, hundreds of generators, hundreds of thermals, all kinds of stuff distributed last mile to units that we were working with for less than pennies on the dollar. Right. So it's really kind of forward leaning kinetic stuff being supported by individuals who would never otherwise necessarily have a role to play in the national security arena, which is really worth taking note of.
Yeah, if I could build off that point, Jesse, and Ryan, to your point, I think it's worth remembering that social systems, at least the way I think about it, are closer to biology than engineering. And by that, I mean, like, it's one thing to say, like, this committee of practice did or did not have this input and it didn't fit the structure. I find more often that it's helpful to think of these as ecosystems where you have cross-pollination in a complex versus complicated environment. Complicated environments, I can engineer my way to success. And if I have enough time with enough whiteboards, I can solve it. I think a lot of the environments that we're used to working in are emergent systems. And the reason that's relevant is an introduction I make now might not be relevant for 5 years, but that doesn't make it ineffective. I think it just makes it harder to measure. And so I think it's really important when you have these fluid social networks to not mistake what you can see today with the aggregate outcomes. And so there's a lot of value, I think, in setting conditions for effective communication, collaboration, and cross-cultural competence, and making sure people can listen effectively. Jesse, to your point earlier on, like, veterans cooling over to Ukraine, there's a lot of power in equipping our ambassadors to go out and be translators between worlds. And I think the more we can build those bridges, the more effectively we can react. And inherently, we can't predict the future. I think we've all been told a quote, like, we have a perfect record of predicting the future. We've been wrong every time. And so I think instead of trying to design the perfect mousetrap, we're empowered when we instead ask what elements of an ecosystem we want to cultivate.
Yeah, but to Ryan's point, what makes this more indelible? And this may not. Death may fall apart at some point. It is, all these social systems are just like Jay said, they're organic. They're living creatures. I think the thing that Jesse and I have been thinking a lot about for DEF, though, is activating it with purpose. And that's where I think these organizations do come together. I mean, think about every cocktail party you went to where it was some meet and greet and you don't remember anyone from it because it was just set up to be its own contrivance, right? But with DEF, especially, and some of these networks that all three of us have, we pulse test these things with something important. We have to get somebody into a country. We have to help solve a problem. And I think that is one of the critical components, and it's a sort of a cultural component of these organizations, that you have to pulse them with purpose and activate them with purpose. And so that's something that I know Jesse thinks a lot about with the Defense Entrepreneurs Forum.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense, right? Because as you guys are talking, I'm thinking about like just the ability to give a damn or finding the right people that care. I am assuming, I could be wrong, like those that have gone to Ukraine to support were kind of doing it out of their own free will because they felt like they needed to. They felt like they were passionate about it, which is incredible, right? The fact that you've effectively created this network of, I don't know how else to say it, but people that give a damn, that actually care about the problem and want to solve the problem, as opposed to a checkbox on a resume or something that my boss asked me to do, or like whatever those 9,000 other things that are templated from a career standpoint. So am I leaning towards the right answer there? I feel like there's a difference between the hey, my entire team, you guys should join this COP because it's going to be good for you to learn something. I'll call it solving an informational problem versus being there because they want to be there individually.
I think you're hitting on something that we all collectively were just talking about not too long ago is, give a shit is teachable too, or it's at least parameterized. So you think about how to get through to kids in school. You think about how to get through to employees in an organization that are just demotivated. There is a pathway to give a shit. There is a pathway to getting people reactivated and excited. It just, you might not have those skills as a manager to do something like that or as a leader. And so by sort of inculcating some of those skills through purpose, through activation, I think you can actually bring, give a shit to the purpose or to the surface versus I think, some of the people that is just inherently woven into their fabric, like Jesse here and Jay, where that is, they always have the stink of that on them, to just push the metaphor to the right. But it is something that you can activate. And again, especially with Gen Zers and millennials, they're waiting to be activated in that space. And once you do, I think you're going to have something pretty special.
I want to tee up Jay here. I think, this gets into something that I know all of us are really passionate about in this call is education, like, enforced modernization. Are we training our young warfighters to think like this? And a lot of us are on the term cultural empathy, right? And we have civil affairs, we have foreign area, officers. But what are we doing about innovation in those educational pipelines? With the emergence of innovation officers, what does that training look like? And Brad, last time I say here is Brad, what I love about hanging out, in your space, and Ryan, to your point, is you will come across any walk of life from kids to, the most forward-leaning, tier 1 units, being educated on, call it a hard skill, but really it's the soft skills that building momentum pushes. And I would say it's almost allegorical to help people understand how to think and feel and perceptualize their environments and themselves in relation to place very differently, which I'm not so sure is something that we're really effectively training, in the national security apparatus writ large.
Yeah, if I could lean into a bunch of points that you both made. The first is, I think, when you look at leading change effectively, it's hard to overstate the importance of both expanding awareness and increasing confidence. And the reason I bring that up is I think one of the first steps to leading change effectively is to know that the current state doesn't have to be the end state. Like there's a classic Henry Ford quote, like if I ask people that want to do it, I said a faster horse. And I think what we've seen with change in government, the first break or the wall to break is being limited by the bounds of the known. And to Jesse's point, I think one of the challenges often with leading change in government, especially on the military side of the house, is that for the average officer, and I come from an Army background, so I can speak to that, there's no point in your normal progression where you're going to be exposed to what digital technologies can do to enhance your organic requirements, your organic warfighting mission. So it's really easy to see this as an extraneous other or like this novelty that's off to the side. But as soon as you start breaking down the preconceived perceptions that leaders have about the role of the technology or innovative capabilities play in their mission, that awareness is the first piece. The next is like, how are we effectively enabling confidence and leading change? And how are we starting to move through these massive organizations, ideas that can catalyze readiness and performance and responsiveness? And I think what we consistently see is that organizations are going to struggle because they're deterministic and they're really complicated. There's a lot of assumptions that have to make things work. Networks are fluid. Like ideas can move across networks. Talent can move between networks. And so I think the more we focus on equipping individuals to navigate effectively and to build these resilient networks, the more we also share ideas. And the faster share ideas, the more effectively you can see them spread. And I think one thing that you can shape at the institutional level, though, is that the more we raise the baseline of education for the force, and because this is the CDAO, I'm thinking about like digital literacy, understanding the role of technologies. If we can increase general competence in these highly technical domains, you enable more effective collaboration. Like in an acquisition side, like the more informed the customer, the more effective the outcome. And I think in a lot of other spaces, the more I can curate the problem and a really tailored ask for what I'm seeking to achieve, the more effectively I can work with others to get there. And so I think we need to enable decentralization and fluidity at the edge while making sure that the core is enhancing both the infrastructure enablement to achieve the mission and also the quality of questions getting asked by looking deeply at our schoolhouses of centers for changing and leading culture.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think let's kind of dive into the human capital people side of things. I know earlier we talked about the Gen Z, the millennial, what's working, what's not working in terms of, I'll call it acquisition of human capital.
I think there's really interesting people doing, great work. I mean, Jay can speak to Gig Eagle, Colonel sailing with, USEREC and the new innovation directorate. Folks are thinking about like, how do we adapt the message? There's a lot of work, I think, great work being done on the inside and models being looked at, to include direct commissioning, which, I think Jay is also probably best suited to speak to. But, one thing I think there's a huge opportunity to improve is that the vast majority of the capability and capacity that we need, that one of our greatest advantages as a nation is our entrepreneurial prowess. It's just deeply baked into us. And, that's what we call a weapon system, right? And I keep coming back to Ukraine, not because I'm like virtue signaling and forget the geopolitical, whatever your stance is, but it's a really important sandbox, right? To look at the types of people and the organizations and how things got done and what was moving. And at least, all we can do is speak from our personal experience, but in running around in these places all over the world, whether it's Philippines or the Hades or, or what have you, it's the local small business owner or the truck driver or the young, small, tiny little NGO or these young teenagers like in Puerto Rico that are moving mountains and like doing incredibly forward leaning, important things. And we've always had a hard time recognizing and supporting that informal capacity. And I think we're really, if we need to do one thing a little bit better is we need to lean into celebrating that as a true capability and figuring out beyond the traditional like contracting constructs that we have with the primes or otherwise, how we can more effectively delineate or, welcome in these informal actors and give them the top cover, required to empower them to their, maximal effect.
Yeah. I think the case study that was really interesting on this was with the Marine Corps. So we've trained something like 10,000 Marines to date on how to build drones, how to make their own robots and networks and use, ChatGPT and weld and, think of any skill you might need to learn to get yourself high tech or low tech out of a situation. But when we started applying this initially about 9 years ago, it was met with like, Marines can't do this. Marines should be shooting and end of list. Like that was the way the Corps kind of looked at it. And what happened then is we would start training these kids. They would really be empowered to do something. But the greatest takeaway from the training was a permission structure. And so when the pandemic hit, the groups and organizations that were making the most gains within the Corps and actually within the entire DoD were these little Marine groups that we had just trained that had 3D printers and laser cutters and, drone capabilities and robot capabilities. And they were just going for it. And the reason that is they just felt like they had the permission structure. We had trained them and then everyone kind of got out of their way because there was, we taught them some alien new technique that no one had ever done. So they must be the only one that can shepherd this through. And it was a really interesting, case study that even if the training is almost really about anything, it's really the permission structure to say, okay, now go be a Maverick. Now go be a Vanguard in this space. And then they do. And it's actually pretty remarkable to see.
Building off those points, I think something that we need to be willing to have a hard conversation about as a department is we're getting to the point where there's a new set of foundational design assumptions that need to govern how we think about talent. Like one of the stats that always gets my attention is Instagram was acquired for $1 billion with less employees than I need to run Gate Guard at Fort Liberty. Like at a fundamental level, the way we think about power laws and talent and exponential impact requires us to have really different approaches to how we recruit, train, develop, and deploy. And that extends not just in recruitment, but it also comes into like how we lead. Like the Napoleonic staff structure was great for a long time, but it's also worth asking, can that decision-making framework keep up with machine speeds? And so as we think about talent, there comes to a point where it's not just about bringing new generations into what is, but at what point do we do a Goldwater Nichols style rebuild or start to burn down some of the existing assumptions and create something net new? Because the foundational constraints are scaled. Like an example of this, the military historically has recruited younger people to serve, 18, 24, whatever. Then they have a 20-year career and then they retire on the other side. As robotics shift the way we think about the work to be done and as more and more can be done remotely, it might be worth asking questions about what is the right senior age limit. I think that we've all seen a lot of people that have retired and done really well in the industry that want to serve. And historically, it's been really hard to come back in on the other side. It's seen as like something you missed. But if I'm looking for judgment and I'm looking to turn insights into code that can scale algorithmically across the force, I might not need someone who is 18 to do this work. I may actually benefit from someone who's got really refined judgment and a lot of experience. And so I think we need to be willing to ask, like, what do I actually need from which parts of the service and what capabilities are most relevant to the problems we're solving? And at what point do we start to deconstruct foundational assumptions that are arguably based on linear and industrial models and move to like a much more emergent form of organizational architecture? And I think we're seeing that modularity in different parts of the DoD, but I don't know that we've taken that to core. And the consequence then is we're treating a lot of individuals like interchangeable parts. And inherently, I just don't know that that's the right construct for where we are as a nation.
Well, just to jump in on that really quick, Jay, you say something really interesting that made me think that we take these young kids in the military that are extremely open-minded. They are coming into this with just no preconception and no prejudice based on their learning or whatever. And then we homogenize them, shave their heads, march. And then over the course of their career, we ask them to start thinking, more critically, thinking outside the quote unquote box as they get older. But humans naturally aren't that way, right? As we get older, we get more set in our ways. So it's interesting. It's a really fascinating cultural experiment that we've built. It's like the Henry Ford model is still in place in assembly lines within the DoD. But talk about talent. Like we should really think about taking these young kids who are really brilliant thinkers and just pour gas on that instead of like homogenizing everybody. And I'm just wondering if there's an opportunity here for the DoD to really kind of embrace it.
It's almost like an hourglass where you have like these beautiful tons of resources and creativity and wide open mind. Then we pinch them and constrict it, and then we expect it to open up again. On the downside.
I like that.
Yeah.
And to build up both those points, like a model that gets my attention, I spent a lot of time meditating on, is the power of trapped capacity. So if you look at some of the most valuable businesses of the 21st century, they're about resourcefulness, not resources. So Uber, for example, or Airbnb, it's about what is all the existing underleveraged capacity around me? And how do I create new mechanisms to match that capacity to a need in real time so that I can more effectively solve a problem? And the reason I think that's relevant is a lot of service members are under immense stress, and it's definitely challenging to serve. But I think based on my experience, if you ask them, do you honestly believe that 100% of your gifts are being used 100% of the time? The answer for people who say yes, that might be a little bit less than we might like. And the reason that's powerful is if you can build systems that start to break down these barriers and enable more effective decentralized excellence, like suddenly you're using more of the capacity we already have. And I think that allows us, everyone laments a no-growth environment, but I think that's only a real constraint if every dollar or person you have is used to 100% of capacity. I don't know that that's usually the case. And that means that instead of asking for more, we might be better served by challenging the how for utilization, and in so doing, really unlock a ton of incredible opportunities for service members, for the civilian communities around us, and then for national security.
Yeah, no, this is a great conversation. And Brad, you reminded me of, I think it was just last week, we had Matt Pine on from the Marines, talking about, everything he's doing with advanced, manufacturing, production at the point of need. And, I didn't say it to him at the time, but my immediate reaction was what you just caveated, which was, wait, aren't you a Marine? And so what are we doing here? And so, I love that we're tearing down that stereotype.
I mean, that's a great example of that, right? I trained him 8 years ago or something. And I think, at the time, he's a warrant officer now, but there's still like a little bit of, am I going to use this? And it's not that you're going to learn how to build a drone and use that immediately, which is, I think, again, a little antithetical to training. It's sort of like, we talked about this the other day. It's sort of like first aid training, right? You get first aid training, but you hope you never have to use it. And you have to get it again. You have to kind of get recerted. Why does anyone get first aid training if they don't get to go use it? And I think that's a lot of the skills that at least my company teaches, but I know that I think would be useful to be sort of more, pervasive across all these communities is skills that you may not need now, but that you'll need later. And Matt was a perfect example because they did some amazing stuff on a ship recently where they needed a part fix. I think you probably talked about that.
Yep.
And he came to the rescue, right? So did we teach him how to fix that part? And we never did. No way. But we did teach him to think differently about problem sets. And again, it's about this permission structure and the empowerment to just get after it. Like, don't give a shit, right? Like, go do it. And he did. And the guy is a legend because of these types of movements that he's made within the Marine Corps. But again, it can be taught. It can be inculcated in culture.
If I could build off Brad's point real quick, because I think it's really time. Another one of those critical design assumptions that we have to break is service member as creator versus service member as consumer. I think we grew up with this model that's like a one-way factory where like factories produce a widget and then it goes to the soldier and the soldier uses it, but he doesn't shape it. And I think what we've seen with AI2C or the Army Software Factory or Kessel Run or a litany of other efforts to include the 3D printing stuff you just mentioned, Brad, is that service members can now create. And that seems like a semantic difference, but philosophically, I think it's massive because you're shattering walls about who gets to solve problems and who gets to make capability that in turn require us to ask very hard questions about how to reorganize to empower them. And Jesse and Brad, I know you're both passionate about that.
Yeah. I think the biggest thing that, interests me is, we look at like, requirements, right? And, the gold standard is, I want to get the best technology into the warfighter's hands as soon as possible. And one of the major hangups in, the contracting world and the dual use world was, man, I wish I had more insight from the warfighter, right? And one thing I would argue, and I think, there's a real opportunity here to kind of broaden the aperture is, with the exception of like the IC and, soft, I guess, how does the warfighter know what we need given what we're currently facing? Right. I don't mean that to be a slight. And I think that's a very kind of grandiose statement, but there's, given these geopolitical realities, we don't have a lot of people on the ground really truly observing what the nature of like the in-situ realities are and then relaying them back to a system, that can empathize with that. Right. And certainly I'm not saying there aren't kind of, carte blanche, but I think we've got the opportunity to leverage, whether it's prior service folks or particularly if we can start training people to be more observant, getting them into these environments, and learning to be like truly empathetic, right? Not going back and, and we still see a lot of our capacity in the US, and I'm not poo-pooing this, but all these companies focusing on developing widgets and sending things and hardware into these various environments as the fix. When, and very blatantly, that's not what the environment needs or calls for, right? So I'm curious as to how we can leverage existing talent, maybe outside the traditional force construct, to identify those needs quicker, feed them into the system, and then how we can get the system to start training around being able to kind of train for those observations and to ingest them, so we can start developing things that are, most relevant for our partners.
Yeah, it's kind of like dumping a whole box of screwdrivers and saying, there you go fix your problems. And, it may require not screwdrivers. It may require other things. I think creativity is a really interesting comment that Jay made. And we were chatting about this earlier too. It's that, is the technology is dying for that creativity to be unleashed upon it. Like, think of the technological inflection point, during the 50s and 60s and 70s, even NASA, DARPA, CIA, the ARLs of the world. These were the boundary layers of technology. This is the forefront of technology. And then that is not the case anymore. And so the consumer world has driven technology to be a lot more, accessible. Take a software-defined radio, something Ukrainians are using left, right, and center on the battlefield right now. 5-8 years ago, it took a PhD to build and construct one of these things on a breadboard. And so, every piece of technology is getting to be more user-centric. Like, if you look at everything from what iPhones and all these sort of engagements that you have on your device, everything has gotten easier. Cars have gotten easier. Everything has gotten just more accessible. So it's dying for us to use it creatively. I think it just comes down to the permission structure and allowing that to go, even to ends that are not, advantageous, even to disasters, even to failures. Let that creativity be unleashed.
Yeah, sorry. Again, we're just ripping off each other. I think what's worth noting is failure is a relative term. And to lean into Brad's point, like in Silicon Valley, investors know that you're going to need 100 companies to play with that idea to find the two that are going to make it work. Like Google is the 20th search engine to market. So we need to have the space for fluidity. And something else that both these guys have hit on that I just want to underscore is we know that we don't know what the future holds. Like Nassim Taleb wrote a fantastic book called Anti-Fragile. And he goes into the fact that we don't even have conceptual models for handling chaos. But you want to architect for our system to actually get better with chaos. And I think when you start decomposing, where do we find that to be true? It's when we really empower individuals and give them the tools and the training to understand how to decompose chaos into signal and make really informed decisions. And then you have to empower those individuals by placing out the networks that can move fluidly. And the tension there is that inherently you're decentralized. You can keep standards high at the core in terms of training and who you let in, but to maintain pace with chaos, you have to permit people at the edge to move. And so I think we're going to have to be really comfortable with new management styles. So they're going to be mission command to the next level, especially as you start looking at moving at machine speeds.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. You hit on the tech, and Brad, you talked about software defined radios, and, I live in the acquisition world. We're constantly talking about taking advantage of new technology, the commercial side of things, integrating Silicon Valley, all of that. I have a note written down about dual use companies, and potentially that's not the sole answer to national security. So I wanted to let you guys dive into that.
Oh, pick me.
Yes, go for it.
I think what's happening is awesome, right? I think we are adapting, and we're adapting pretty quickly. And I hate to keep using Ukraine as the example because there's so many more examples of this, but this is just where I saw it. It was so stark, right? Week 2, week 3 over there became very evident as to the dynamic in the tech cycles and what was happening and how the whole of society truly mobilized. Every 16-year-old college kid, was in the basement hacking to solve something, and very quickly, private businesses adopted, units and supported them. And that dynamic, like that social construct, I would argue, is the innovation, right? And yet it took, and we're now seeing this huge surge in defense investing and venture capital firms that are popping up in dual use companies. And it's the cool guys space of the day. And that's great. And we're seeing phenomenal resources being pumped into the system. But I think we need to get better and quicker at, and I think Jay can speak to this, and it kind of ties into Parlay in my mind, is we need to identify and really be able to celebrate what the ground truth is. And I know we say that, and it's kind of a cavalier statement, but again, week 2, week 3, the needs in Ukraine were evident. And it wasn't until about a year and a half, I would say, a year, where we really start seeing the dual use community and the venture capital community split up and say, I got a guy in Ukraine. We're tied in with the drone units. We know what's going on. Their tech cycles are in 20, and that's great. But it took us way too long. And, I would argue we need to expedite that adoption cycle. And then secondarily to that, I would look at our investment thesis and our revenue models. And are we incentivized economically to really create advantageous solutions to provide the actual true needs of the environment? And I would say currently that answer is no, right? Because a lot of these funds that I'm personally invested in, and these companies I'm involved with, which again, I think are tremendous, are still trying to create, in their best intention, like these things, these technological, physical outputs, and sending them into these various environments when they get thrown in a real closet, and not used. And I think that's a huge disservice and a tremendous waste of brain capital, resources, and time. And, to quote Alexis Bonnell here, time, however she phrases it, is the most critical resource and asset that we have to treasure. And we just have to get better at identifying the true needs and then figuring out the populace that can address them in a more sensitive way.
If I could hop onto that one, Jesse, I think one of the I'm awesome to see the Silicon Valley is embracing the defense and dual use community. So let me begin by saying, let's acknowledge and appreciate that very much. I think one of the challenges, at least for my foxhole, is if we make the presumption that the key to success are certain technical capabilities and military capabilities for the fight right now, I can't help but wonder if we're mischaracterizing the threat environment itself, right? And making that more explicit. If this is about great power competition and I'm engaged in what might be an intergenerational struggle, then it's not enough to necessarily be able to find, fix, finish today if the fight doesn't happen for a generation, right? And so what you're forced to do as national security community and then American people is balance readiness today with enduring capability. And what that means is you actually have to ask really hard guns versus butter questions about how do we want to balance emerging requirements and future optionality and having a base of strategic decisions. And so I think what we're seeing is the health of the country writ large. And to Jesse's point, we ended up founding a fintech that helps with small business access to capital. Because what we ended up seeing was, by the time we have troop recruitment shortages today and the Army misses its numbers, and then you do the 5Y analysis, and behind that is we can't have enough healthy, fit, or educated individuals interested in service. And then behind that, we find, health outcomes are usually tied to healthy food access, and that's usually tied to not being in a food desert, which is usually tied to having access to capital. Or education outcomes are tied to tax bases, which are tied to home ownership. You end up seeing that a lot of the investments we need to make are these very important, but sometimes hidden below the waterline requirements that allow us to be much more effective as a collective. And so I think there's a lot of power in making sure that we don't over-optimize for one type of threat, especially if it doesn't end up being the challenge we face.
Like the new Abrams tank model coming out in late 2037 or something. It's those decisions, right? It's it's not realizing that you can already see some of the future. The dual use technology word kind of rubs me the wrong way because I think it's a lot of times building something that the military thinks they need, and then, can we sell it to industry somehow? Ask industry, they're going to just build what they're going to build. And if the military can use it, then that's fine. That's great. And so I feel like the dual use tech, phraseology is just a little bit weighted towards trying to trying to tie a rock to a rabbit type thing. It's the government trying to speed up to the pace of industry, but industry is moving so fast. And frankly, if you're going to go, again, Ukraine, perfect example, you grab what's on your shelf, right? and you grab what you know. And so, as much as they would love to have Reaper drones and all these types of, they just grab what they know, and they went off with the technologies and the access of things that they had. So I think there's that notion of like, we can already see the future. We just have to realize someone has to make some hard decisions. Like, why are we building another Abrams tank variant for 2037? Every country in the world by then will have a very good, robust, small drone program. Like, what cultural shifts do we need to start thinking about for real? Like hard cultural shifts for real.
That's super appreciated. And I agree. I know the three of you have super entrepreneurial backgrounds, obviously all running various startups. Getting a little close to time here, so I just wanted to go around the room and anything related to entrepreneur spirit, or even just closing remarks in terms of wanting the listeners to take away. And I'll toss it over to you all and go around the room.
Yeah, I'll start. I think that I think the country and the population writ large is starving to be of service. I think that there's a general lack of modern pathways to make that happen, right? And a lot of folks just haven't put on the uniform yet, or will not for whatever reason. But that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be a way for them to have impact. And I think that this day and age, again, I think that there's venture capitalists and entrepreneurs and teachers and logisticians and folks who are vitally important to our national security community, and that we need to do a far better job getting the whole of society involved and on board with this conversation, and not from like a fear mongering, the world it's cataclysmic, but like, hey, you have a lot of value and critical skills and resources and cultural expertise and connections and networks that are really, really important. We'd love to involve you. So, our personal passion is creating models, entrepreneurial startup businesses that leverage existing constructs, call it climbing gyms, co-working spaces, nightclubs. We had a readiness training social club. It's just, how can we onboard more people, bring families and people in, and teach them these skills? Yes, medical skills, how to read a map. But again, it's not about the hard skills. It's just seeding the conversation and exposing them to veterans and first responders and folks, and creating those, that cross-pollination. So folks become accustomed to and understand that there's value across spheres, and they make those connections and they find pathways to get involved. And whether that's becoming a firefighter, EMT, or just somehow supporting one of our crazy random adventures, there's a lot of ways to get involved, and we need to support that as a country and look at service more, entrepreneurial.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate it. Jay?
Yeah, there's a scene I love in We Were Soldiers where Mel Gibson is talking to one of his junior officers, and he's asked, like, how does he reconcile being a father and officer? And he says that he hopes that being good at one makes him better at the other. And I think my experience so far as a founder and entrepreneur has been that that's true in a service capacity. Like, there's skills that you learn in one domain that I think really enable you in the other. And if you're effective about consistently finding alignment and calibration, I think you're able to be much more effective, right? So the military teaches you to focus on disciplined execution and gives you the skills you need to withstand a lot of the uncertainty and chaos that comes with being an entrepreneur. But I think entrepreneurship treats you about the importance of making sure you're really efficient with time, and that you're always asking questions about optimizing value, and that you're building systems that are really impactful and effective. And I think what we're seeing is that a lot of the traditional walls around what constitutes effective service are breaking down. And there's a lot of opportunities to continue advancing the mission and the learning skills you might not be able to learn in uniform as a civilian or as a founder, as an entrepreneur, that you can then connect either directly or indirectly to military mission and needs. And so I hope that we start encouraging people to lean out entrepreneurship, not as like an either or binary transition. Like, I'm a service member and then I go through a one-way shoot and I'll never ever be of use again, to the military in a traditional sense. And instead we ask a much more empowering question, which is like, how can we equip our teams, our people, and service members to be all of themselves? And if we do that effectively, I think you end up growing economic strength, which is critical, while training your people to handle a whole new type of problem that then allows them to continue serving in a way that's really impactful. So I think it's really important that we expand the conversation and make this about building collaborative networks. And we recognize that all things come in seasons, and there's a lot of power in giving people space.
Yeah, awesome. Brad, over to you.
I just think we got the next title of of our next podcast. Because Jay, you said something really cool that it made me think about this while you were talking. Is that I think veterans or people in the military they're sort of organically entrepreneurial onto their own right. They've been, go take that hill, go take that hill any way you need to, and then people will figure out how to take that hill. And yet, this is my hypothesis. Does technology actually remove that? Go take that hill with this radio and this gun, not go take that hill with anything you can find. And you start to narrow in that entrepreneurial spirit, because being an entrepreneur is really having your back against the wall, and either you're going to sink or swim, and you just look around with what you have in front of you, and you just make it happen, right? That is being an entrepreneur. You just make shit happen with what's around you. And the military is actually really good at teaching the hang in there of that, the just, suck it up and keep going. Cause that's the other part of the entrepreneurial spirit. You just got to suck it up every day. Something's going to be thrown at you and you just can't give up. You have to keep going. And so the military has that part, but then they start putting these platforms and procedures and technology around those kids that are given that, the ability to go take that hill. So I think part 2 of this podcast, does technology actually reduce our ability to be creative? And that's like, again, antithetical to what I was saying earlier. So I don't know.
I think a precursor, I don't want to give away the name, but I think for an upcoming conference, we already have something in the works of AI doesn't make you dumb, I think is the name of it. So we may have already concluded it from our end, but on a very specific use case. No, awesome. This was a great conversation. Jesse, Jay, Brad, just thank you so much for being on today.
Thanks for having us.
This has been great.
Grateful to chat with everyone. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks.